Pessoal, bom dia. Bom, agora a gente vai fazer a apresentação do professor Jean-François Mercure, que é professor da Universidade de Exeter. Eu nunca consigo pronunciar essa palavra direito, Exeter, mas ele é um grande amigo meu, a gente já trabalhou em alguns projetos juntos, e ele tem bastante experiência em modelos de equilíbrio geral, modelos macroeconômicos, com foco na área de energia e na área de meio ambiente também. Tá, a apresentação também está sendo transmitida pelo YouTube, então quem não conseguir seguir pelo Zoom, eu vou colocar no chat aqui o link, né, de maneira que vocês possam acompanhar de lá, caso haja alguma dificuldade. Bom, thanks again, Jean-François. Well, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Amaro. Thanks for inviting. Hello, everybody. Happy to be with you. I can't see you, but very happy to be there. Amaro said he was interested in, and you'd be interested in, topics related to macroeconomics. We do a lot of that, and I think I decided I'd recycle a piece I presented at Duke University last year, except I've updated it a bit. And it was interesting to talk to people in the US last year, and now it's great to talk to you. So yeah, I'm at the University of Exeter. In Exeter, we have a lot of climate scientists. We have a major number of climate scientists, of British climate scientists, and the Met Office is there. So some of you might actually work with the Met Office, the Hadley Center. But not so many people do the macroeconomics of climate policy. So that's why I ended up here actually, as I recently joined a year ago. But I also work with Cambridge Econometrics. Some of you might know, I think Amaro said Hector gave a presentation. So
Yes,
Hector,
yes.
Yeah. Hector and I work together all the time. In fact, our work is inseparable now. There's always our two names on every paper that comes out almost. So, okay. Yeah, there's the team. Exeter, Cambridge Econometrics, University of Cambridge. Open University is climate scientists. Ironically, I don't work with the climate scientists in Exeter because these are older friends than when I moved there. But we work for the UK government as well as the European Commission, and different funders have worked with us. Okay, so I was going to start with this. So that's work that Hector did, and I often use this slide. They had been analyzing the economic impacts of EU climate policy, the long-term energy roadmap. Typically, when they do that, they hire two different teams of modelers. The team in Athens, which is quite well known. They have the Gemini 3 model. Pantelis Kapros and Leonidas Parousos. They've got very good models there. And the other team is ours at Cambridge Econometrics and Exeter. And then we analyze the macro impacts of policies, and typically the Greeks with their CG model get slight negative GDP impacts for climate policy, and we get a positive impact. Now that always puzzles people. Well, of course, the policymakers, they don't like it, but they find it not too bad in some sense because it gives them a range. They say, well, it's between plus 2% and minus 1%. They think it can't be too bad. I mean, 2%, 3% would be quite a bit, but minus 1%, I guess, is or less than 1% is reasonable. So they can take that as a range, but it's not great that your analysis is opposite for the two models. If you had hired only just one model, you would have had something completely different as a picture, right? You would have thought this is good or bad. Okay, well, what's the reason? So eventually the commission asked us to look into this. I was in charge of that report, and we studied that. It's published now in Climate Policy. I'll put it here. Here there's Hector's paper, the role of money and finance. at the top, and there's my paper with Hector, is just swap the names really, where we have the results of this study looking at why the models give opposite results. Okay, so I'll talk about that. But I wasn't just going to talk about that. I was going to talk about more generally, there's issues about using cost-benefit analysis or equilibrium macroeconomics to look at the climate problem, and I'll say why. So if you were going to work with cost-benefit analysis, like that's what you would do in the UK and the US. I don't know in Brazil, maybe we can talk about this later, what people use, but so what you need if you use cost-benefit analysis, you need clear costs and clear benefits. If the picture's unclear, you have an ambiguous answer. And one case that could make it ambiguous is if, for example, the costs are negative, or let's say that the costs don't increase with the level of abatement, but the costs start to decrease because of learning by doing or things like this. Okay, so what you need is well-defined mitigation costs, well-defined climate costs. You need these things to meet somewhere, if you use Nordhaus's model, for example. And you need uncertainty that is bounded. You need to know what the uncertainty is, and you can't have long-tailed uncertainty. Now, it'll stop working, yeah, precisely. If, say, the costs decrease with the level of ambition, then it starts to fail. If the upper bound of costs is not bounded, for example, climate costs are not bounded at the top, that's a problem. And if there are unknowns, if you're not able to have a complete enumeration of the possible outcomes, then your answer is ambiguous. So and especially I think they're not the right tools when you talk about innovation, because innovation can have precisely these effects where you could have unbounded or an incomplete list of possible outcomes of your policy. So for example, you've got Germany imposing feed-in tariffs, and then the Chinese invest in solar energy, and then the cost of solar go down, and then the whole world starts to buy solar panels, and then the costs keep going down, and eventually it becomes cheap for the whole world, and cheap for Germany too. And then they don't have this, they can get rid of this feed-in tariff, and then some people in Germany were saying this is a failure of policy because it's inefficient. But in fact, it kind of transformed the world of technology. So in fact, the costs kept, and now the cost of solar in some places are cheaper than coal, right? And that you could describe with the decision of Germany to impose feed-in tariffs. Okay, so imagine Nordhaus's model. You've got your climate damages increasing with the level, with the level of emissions, cumulated emissions, and then the marginal costs that increase with the level of ambition with reducing emissions. And then you think the optimal carbon price would be where these two meet. Now you'd bring in some level of uncertainty, so you could say the carbon price, the ideal carbon price would be in that little diamond shape in the middle. But what if as you reduce emissions, the trajectory actually starts to go down in cost? It never meets the climate damages. Then you obviously don't have an answer to cost-benefit analysis, right? Well, you could also have something else where actually there are two answers. One where you do a minimal amount of investment, and one where you do a lot of investment. And there could be a situation where you could have invested more and it could have led to even lower costs, but you might have got stuck at what you thought was the optimal point, while there could have been a much better situation out there that you didn't consider existed because you were using a simple model. Okay, so that's kind of where I think the dynamics of technology and finance really have to be kind of understood. I mean, I'm not saying everybody uses Nordhaus's model, almost nobody does, but it's sort of an illustration, right? Okay, and then the last, I guess, important concept I wanted to mention is that, before I really get going, is if you have a distribution, a probability distribution of outcomes of a decision that is unbounded in the upper range, or that is long-tailed. If it's long-tailed, it means that if you calculate the mean, it has no value. It diverges to infinity. That's because there's too much weighting on the upper end of the distribution. So here you think of the distribution of costs of climate change associated with a certain amount of warming. So the warming is heavy-tailed already. It has a longer tail at the upper end. And then if you translated that to cost, following Nordhaus's sort of a function of costs, damage function, you'd find that actually a 7 to 10 degree world is infinite cost because the cost is as big as global GDP or something like that, right? But in fact, it's just that because you've got too much weighting at the upper end, you just can't calculate this because you're adding large numbers with small numbers, and it just gives an ambiguous answer, right? It's just not, it's not the right thing to do. So calculating costs with a long tail, but that's so the climate gives you a long tail, right? But I think innovation also gives you a long tail because there are many possibilities that come out of your innovation policy. So, okay. So that's Weizmann's dismal theorem, as it's called. If any of you want to know more, I can send you material. Okay, and then, but innovation is a complex process. In fact, it's mostly to do with the fact that technologies are connected to technologies. So as you develop electric batteries for electric cars, you actually develop all sorts of other applications like household energy storage, or maybe grid level energy storage, or all of these things kind of come together where you develop one key innovation, and then all of these start to go down in cost or in availability, and it transforms the system more than, you know, just having costs, right? So that it's a whole cluster of technology that together evolves, and that then becomes very path dependent. It depends exactly on what the history is and how you got there. Okay, and then lastly, you'd say it's hard to monetize or calculate or give value to the outcomes of policy. You can have inequality effects, unemployment, regional disparity. GDP is not a good proxy. Well, I'm sure people in Brazil agree with that mostly. GDP is not a good proxy for assessing the outcomes, right? It's just a strange proxy for what is good and bad. It's a measure of something, but not good and bad. But there's other things: health, life, quality of environment, and then of course policymakers need to look at all these things. But no one can really claim to know the exact outcomes for all of these aspects. But you can tell which direction things are taking with the policy. So in some sense, we have an obsession in the field of looking at the end point, the outcome, while what we should look is the direction of change. And this is what some colleagues of mine are telling me at the UK government, which I'm starting to think is increasingly interesting to think that way. Okay. Okay, this is the rest of the talk. So I'm going to talk about why heterogeneity matters. Not too much because I think we want to hear more about finance, but I'll talk a little bit about heterogeneity in different people, how the fact that people are different is important to consider. I'll talk about interactions a little bit, so how technology behaves as a kind of complex system. Then I'll spend more time on the nature of money and finance. And then if I have time, I might not get to talking about uncertainty too much. Probably not, actually. Okay. Okay, so heterogeneity matters. Okay, so I've studied with colleagues the UK vehicle sector, and actually many countries, and how much people pay for vehicles. It's kind of an interesting thing. You think, well, if we model transforming the transport sector, we'd think about what would be the cheapest sort of solution for transportation. But actually, people, when they buy cars, they don't minimize the cost of cars. Maybe they maximize the cost of cars. Actually, they buy the biggest car they can afford, right? They all have 4 wheels and a steering wheel, but in fact they're quite different, because look at these prices between $20,000 to $80,000. That's like your range. So the width of the distribution of what people buy is as big as the mean, right? The average. And that follows the income distribution, sort of. This is not the same data set, so it's not really a correlation. It just shows that it sort of follows that richer people buy more expensive cars. Now, probably you would think that richer people emit more emissions per kilometer than poorer people, right? Well, poorer people use buses, so that's for sure emits less. Not just poorer people, but of course some poorer people. But so it's a question you could ask. Well, we were looking at that actually. So this is the distribution of costs for different types of vehicles. This the distribution of emissions that matches this. This is a bit old now, by the way. It's 2015, so it's old data. We have newer data, but this is the correlation between them. So yes, so log price at the bottom and emissions linear, the vertical axis. And yes, people who pay more for their car emit more per kilometer in the UK. Although it's not always true, not in every country, but it does seem to follow this. Well, because it's log on the horizontal axis, if you put a carbon price onto road transportation, rich people will not feel the tax because it's small compared to the price of the car. Poor people will feel the tax. So if everybody pays the same price for the same ton of emissions, it's not felt the same by rich and poor, right? So I think their heterogeneity matters for your formation of policy. Okay, these are the distributions in different countries, completely different car markets in every country. So that's why I think heterogeneity matters. The distribution of emissions, it's interesting in the US how much more emissions there are per kilometer than almost every other country. So because they have huge engines in the US compared to Europe, for example. I've got these, but if anybody wants to see this, I can send the paper. These are the regressions, engine size, emissions against engine size, and then emissions against vehicle prices. But okay. These are India, Japan, Brazil. So different countries that you see in India, it's not clear at all. There's not even an R square there. Okay, interactions. Why do interactions matter for climate policy? So typically in models, we assume perfect knowledge. We assume rational expectations and a representative agent. And we assume that people respond to prices, but people don't really interact with one another. But in reality, you know that people interact with one another because they influence each other in buying stuff, right? You know that when there's a new innovation, there's early adopters, and the fact that early adopters adopt the technology allows the early majority to adopt it because the early adopters make a demonstration effect that the early majority and late majority can sort of rely on, right? And many people wouldn't adopt something until a whole load of other people have done it already. You think of new types of mobile phones or new types of, well, when there was a transition between the old mobile phone and the smartphone, it took a while before everybody, and eventually everybody has it, right? And you don't even see the old technology anymore. But there's another effect going on at the same time. There's the companies, when they have a new product, is usually expensive to produce because the scale is small. And as they get sales, they are able to invest in expanding scale, which makes the cost go down. But when the cost go down, it attracts more consumers, which allows them to expand scale more, which makes the cost go down more. And so because you've got early adopters, the price is going down, which also allows the early majority to get the technology at lower price than the early adopters. So this also feeds into itself. So for example, if you had a subsidy at the early phase, it could drive the cost down sufficiently that then you can kickstart the diffusion and then until you get the early majority. But if you didn't have that subsidy at the start, maybe this would never have happened because the cost would always been too high for everybody. And I think that Germany for solar panels did exactly that, right? It was the early adopter effect in some sense that drove the prices down so that the rest of the world, late majority, early majority, can now sort of benefit from solar. Okay, there's this shape of diffusion, which is the adoption rate here. This is throughout history, right? This is the use of different types of energy. It always follows a set of logistic curves like this. The best example is here, the transition between horses and cars in the 20s. I always like to show this because it's sort of funny to imagine what the world was like before. And people had too many horses at some point. They weren't using them anymore because the transition to cars was so rapid. You can see just a few years. It's only just about 20 years. And then all of a sudden, nobody uses horses anymore. It's horse-drawn carriages and then cars replacing them. So that always has that sort of structure. It really is, the more people had cars, the more people were buying cars, right? Okay, and then, well, I don't want to describe this too much, but there's a whole theory in social science about socio-technical transitions that looks at the interaction between diffusion, various aspects of society like culture or regulation, policy, and then there's an overall landscape at the top that sort of controls what's going on, like population and GDP in general. And that's a good description of really how diffusion works. But okay, given that, let's say you wanted to model technological change. If you were going to do a cost minimization for road transportation, you'd think, well, I'm sort of assuming that those rich people are going to try to buy the cheapest car. It's clearly not what's happening. We look at the data earlier. That's not what's happening. In fact, the richer people sometimes are the early adopters. In fact, because they have more resources. Well, you can try to model using S-shaped diffusion curves. So that's something we do in our team. We look at diffusion of technology with S-shaped curves. So what it does is it's that process where more people buy something, the more it's visible, the more people can buy it, the more it's visible. And it follows these dynamics. But first, you need to always remember that technology is always changing, has been changing in history. It's never in equilibrium, it's never stable, it changes. So here, what we're doing is adding successive layers of policy to see where that brings the transportation sector. So you're trying to get more and more electric cars, right? The sort of purple ones. You've got some hybrids that come in and out because somehow hybrids have emissions and we want to get rid of emissions, and eventually they get overtaken by electric cars. And you can see how the structure of old fossil fuel vehicles disappearing. We did a similar study for the household heating systems in the EU, and no, actually this is the whole world. We did 2 studies like that. And also household heating systems are changing all the time. And then you can look at how policy changes the direction of that change, of that evolution, rather than what the endpoint is. It's very uncertain what the endpoint is really, but technology is already changing. Okay, so here you've got oil boilers for houses, gas boilers, coal fireplaces, district heating, electric heaters, electric heat pumps, and so on. So that's another example of technology. Okay, now I'll spend more time on this. How much time have I got? Because I forgot to check my watch.
No, you can go on. That's okay.
Okay. All right. Here I'll spend a bit more time. I think that's more. I get back to this. Okay. So what did we do here when we analyzed the EU's long-term energy roadmap? So, okay. So here the EU asked us to calculate a number of scenarios of technology evolution and the impacts on the economy. And so the impacts are not simple to estimate because they come in many places, and technology is all over the economy, right? You don't just have solar panels and coal plants, but you also have vehicles, but also you've got household devices. It's an energy efficiency in industry, for example. So on one end, you've got a model that tells you it's going to cost GDP, and the framing of people there is thinking, well, we're investing a fraction of GDP into low carbon technology to reduce emissions, and that's kind of displacing investment that would have gone elsewhere, perhaps, and it's so you're sort of investing some of the return of the economy into decarbonizing. But in the other perspective, you've got other people who are like saying, well, actually, we're building new things, so it employs all these people who might have been unemployed before. And actually, because they're working, they're spending money, so actually it raises GDP. Now, why is it that we can have these two perspectives? And in fact, these two perspectives are there since about 100 years. It's the division in economics that hasn't changed for quite some time. In fact, it's Keynes in the versus well, the old classics, so Hicks and so on, back in the 30s, really, until the 50s, and this debate sort of never ended. Okay, so here the Commission asks us, we're going to have a scenario of high energy efficiency, a scenario of diversified energy supply, a scenario of high renewables, one of without CCS, and one with low nuclear. So different options to reach a certain target, and then look at the impacts. The impacts, it's funny, the impacts depend more on the model than on the scenario. Okay, so here's the explanation. So that's a diagram, it's in the paper in climate policy that I was mentioning earlier. Okay, so on one side, on the left, you've got the CGE equilibrium understanding of the economy. I have to say, this is the simplest possible CGE. So some CGE modelers will say, no, that's not what we do. We do something much more intelligent. And I believe then the Greeks, what they do is quite advanced, and they even have a representation of the financial sector in the CGE model. It's really a pretty amazing model. But I think the basic remains a bit like this, right? This division in understanding the flow of money in the economy is very old and has been like that. So in the equilibrium picture, you have a capital stock and you grow that capital stock, right? So capital stock produces, it employs people, people have income, and then people decide between saving and consuming. What they don't consume is saved. What is saved is lent by banks. So that little house there with the columns is a bank. It's lent to people who invest in expanding the capital stock or improving the capital stock with R&D. And then, yeah, that accumulates onto the capital stock. You've got your capital accumulation, and you could consider that human capital is capital as well. So if people study, then they add to the capital stock, which is human capital. So that's the equilibrium picture. In the non-equilibrium picture, what you have, and that's the story from Keynes and Schumpeter from back in the 20s. In fact, you've got demand. People with money have demand for products and services, and then you've got entrepreneurs who sense that demand, and they want to develop new products that will respond to that demand. So they borrow money from the financial institution. They improve or expand the capital stock, and that improves its competitiveness. So there's a price effect. Of course, in the equilibrium picture, there's also a price effect, but it's sort of implicit. Yeah. The competitive, the demand also leads to production, which leads to employment, which leads to income. And after buying the things you normally buy, because the economy is more productive, you've got leftover income, which means that demand has increased. And the entrepreneur senses that demand has increased, so he invests more in the capital stock. But something to be remembered is that if for any reason demand goes down, this goes into the reverse spiral. It goes into a downward spiral, just like now with the COVID virus, right? So there's a disruption to demand. It interrupts this whole cycle. So it's not to do with interrupting the capital stock. It's to do with interrupting demand. in this picture of the economy, right? Okay, so now what the difference is for this picture of the European Commission report. So the difference is here is how we understand finance, and it's that little bank with the dollar sign, really. So on the left, you've got a choice between consuming and saving. So the more you save, the more you consume, the less you save, the less you reinvest in the economy. And you've got a set amount of investment you can put in the capital stock. If you put more in some sector, you have less in other sectors. But on the right, there's no stated limit on credit creation, or at least there's not a specific amount to be lent, and it depends on credit worthiness of the people that are lent to. So that's quite a different understanding. So here you've got this effect called crowding out. That's in the equilibrium picture. When an agent borrows funds to invest into productive capital, this demand diverts funds that would otherwise have been used elsewhere in the economy by bidding upwards the price of finance, which is the interest rate. So for example, for climate change mitigation, you're requiring enormous investment in low carbon capital, say wind turbines and solar panels. And this investment takes away a lot of the savings. There's less savings left for investment in other sectors, and then other industrial sectors like, I don't know what, pharmaceuticals just get less investment because it's been taken away, and this is mediated by the price of finance, the interest rate. Now the question is, does this happen or not, right? Okay, so, and it depends how you understand how money works. Okay, so if you have crowding out, yeah, investment displaces investment elsewhere, that's what I just said. Typically, for a high investment period, GDP, well, if you've invested lots in low carbon capital, you've got less investment elsewhere, that reduces economic growth in those other sectors, which overall reduces economic growth in general. If you don't have crowding out, you have low carbon investments that will not displace finance elsewhere, and because it will employ people, it will raise GDP. That's the key difference there. You've got two types of models giving opposite answers. That's just exactly why. And you could say even more investment in R&D, so what increases productivity in the economy, is exactly the problem as well. So does a low carbon transition increase productivity? It will depend on this, the answer to this question. So we had put this picture in the paper. I have to say, I drew this picture with the colleagues from Athens, and it was interesting because we could debate really how the economy works between us. And we both believe our own sort of perspectives from economics. And I think we're both partially correct, but partially wrong as well. So on the non-equilibrium side, you've got initially, for an energy transition, an initial growth in GDP that then goes down in the future because you accumulate debt and you've got to repay debt back in the future. So when money is created to finance the entrepreneur's activities to expand the capital stock, this is loans, right? It's a pile of loans. Eventually, you can end up with enormous loan repayments. So that would drag GDP. So GDP drag happens later. But in the equilibrium picture, you drag GDP immediately at the start because you're displacing finance from other sectors. And this recovers afterwards when you stop doing that. But also you might have improved productivity, so you could actually get a better picture in the long term. And so that's why the opposite there. Okay, so it's more complicated in reality. You've got another picture. So imagine that there's a sector where in the transition, you stop investing. So the fossil fuel sector, if you stop investing there, in the equilibrium picture, you would free up savings. So you would free up investment and you could invest that elsewhere. So that could be good for the economy. So that's weird. While in the non-equilibrium picture, you'd have the opposite. So if you have less investment in a sector, well, you've got less demand. Nobody wants to invest in there. So you're going to have less demand and less investment. And so you're going to have the downward spiral. And so it's the exact opposite effect. So that could be bad for the economy. So if you mix all these things up, so here's really a complicated map that I'm giving you here. But so imagine you've got a number of policies, okay, that influence the investors and the technology producers. Okay, these people invest in the technology mix of, say, the electricity sector, right? Because of the policies, carbon price, so on. Okay, it changes fuel use, it changes the electricity price, fuel prices, because now people are buying electricity maybe more expensive. We've got emissions, of course, and I want to check what it does to the economy. Okay, one effect is that that's going to have a price effect on energy. So price effects, if the energy price goes up because of your low carbon transition, this is bad for the economy because it will increase consumer prices most likely and industrial prices as well. That will reduce industry output, GDP, employment, income, consumption, industry output, employment, income, and so on and so on. We've got a downward spiral. But at the same time, it invests, so it actually is money that goes to build new things, and that's going to increase industrial activity through, well, there's an R&D path and there's an industry output path that raises employment, income, consumption, output, employment, income, consumption, and so on. So this counterbalances the number one, right? Number two goes up, number one goes down. Number three, is possible that you have a change in government spending because of the policies. Number three and four, actually. So you could use the carbon price to reinvest in the economy, so that could be positive. In fact, the carbon pricing could be quite a bit of money. But then last, you've got some sectors are losing activity because they're not producing anymore, like fossil fuels. So everybody working on offshore oil rigs off the coast stop working, but you've got other people starting to work in making electric cars, for example. So that kind of puts a torsion in the economy where some parts going up, some parts going down. But also there's a whole international trade of fossil fuels that is so high value that really changes. So if say Brazil exports crude to the US, that may not necessarily be replaced by some other, that loss of export is not necessarily replaced by some other gain in export for Brazil, for example, right? It could be different. Okay. Here I'm putting that, it gets really complicated. So that's E3ME, right? E3ME is never simple. It's a massive model. So here I've got a 2-degree transition, and I'm looking at GDP impacts and employment impacts from a baseline, which is the baseline from the International Energy Agency. So in the International Energy Agency, people believe that in the current trajectory, fossil fuel demand will keep going up. So you've got quite large fossil fuel sectors. And then you have a transition. And so you look at the difference in outcome from that. So on the left, you've got fossil fuel production. I took this as an example because I think that's what drives a lot of the changes in the economies. You've got loss of production of fossil fuels. So you can see some countries lose 80% of their fossil fuel production. Well, some of them are just Europe and China, India. They don't really have enormous fossil fuel sectors, but some, like the US, have large fossil fuel sectors, and they can still lose 75% of it if there's a really reduced demand for fossil fuels. And now I've got two scenarios, up above and below. Below, it's where the Middle East decides that they will just push a lot of oil into the international market because they want to sell all of their oil. And that makes things worse for America. So I contrasted the two because it makes things a bit worse for America and Canada. But the two scenarios aren't too different. But in one case, the Middle East doesn't lose its exports of oil. It keeps producing at the expense of everybody else. Okay, for GDP, you can see the differences. So you can see that India and China are gaining GDP because they're building a lot of stuff at the beginning. That's E3ME. E3ME is an unequilibrium model. So that's your, directly there, your investment stimulus effect. While look at Canada and the US, they're losing. They're losing why? Because effectively the fossil fuel sector shuts. It shuts investment in all of the dependent industries that were going to get investment. They don't get that anymore. There's also an effect through the government where there was going to be income from royalties from oil that are not spent by the government anymore. And that not being spent is income that is not spent. So because people are unemployed, say they work for the government and they're unemployed, or and the US also loses a huge amount of employment. That's because the fossil fuel sector has quite a big position in those economies. But in economies where the fossil fuel sector doesn't have a big position, it matters a lot less. Okay, and then you've got, say, places like the Middle East, where they're kind of in the middle because they're able to survive longer. And the difference is they're more competitive in their fossil fuel sector, so they don't really lose so much, but they will lose later. Okay, so there you've got a contrast between different economies. It's not that in I3ME we would say that it always leads to increased GDP. It leads to increased GDP where there's increased investment, and it leads to loss of GDP where there's loss of investment. And then the employment, well, this is just cumulated employment. It just follows the same shape, right? It's sort of the same. And in fact, you could also say that the low carbon investment leads to short-term jobs, because once you've built all of that, you don't need to build much more. So you can see the wavy shape for India. Is it India? Yeah. That actually is new runs. I ran them yesterday. I ran them just a few days ago, actually, because we're working on something like that. So Brazil is not there. I took it out because the results were unstable and it didn't work. It was nonsensical. So the rest of the run is not so good. I can send an update another time once we fixed it. Okay, but that's an example, right? I think that tells you. Okay, so there you go. Macroeconomic impacts of climate policy. Countries are affected not just by domestic policies, but by other countries. So the whole international markets matters. In an equilibrium model, you'd see crowding out effects dominate. So you'd have you can only have negative impacts on GDP. Well, it's maybe more complicated, but in many simple models, that's what you can get. In a non-equilibrium model, you'd see more trade effects happen, at least because the fossil fuels have such a large part of the global economy. Getting rid of it leads to trade effects a lot. Renewables are more sort of evenly distributed across the world. That's partly the story. It's not the whole story, but it's kind of partly that. So if you just have, like in Nordhaus, only negative impacts of climate policy, it's too simple. You always have some positive impacts of innovation anyway, because that increases productivity in a country. So you have to have that. In Nordhaus, it's just not there, right? Money invested in mitigation doesn't disappear. So it's money that's spent by somebody. And I think again, in Nordhaus's model is too simplistic, the circular flow of the economy. Trade effects are important, equilibrium or not, right? Because I mean, in our Greek friends' CG model, you also have an enormous impact through trade that's happening, and that's there too. So it will affect US GDP, the fact that China adopts electric cars. Whichever model you use, you should see that sort of thing, right? But one should calculate debt, though. The government debt can become quite high. For two reasons. One is you could have the government investing in low carbon technology, but that's not the worst. The worst is if you're Canada and you're losing all of that economic activity because people aren't demanding fossil fuels anymore, what you go in deficit spending, just like we're doing now with COVID-19. And that's money borrowed. And so one should really calculate that. It's not that simple. In fact, I don't think anybody in Canada would let GDP slip down as far as what I showed in the earlier graph, because they would go in deficit spending. They would go in debt to revive or create a new sector of the economy or something like that. But it's, okay, private debt is another thing that matters, because this is what leads to financial crisis. So people spending more in in reality doesn't lead to taking away money from taking a part of GDP. It leads to accumulating private debt. Private debt leads to financial instability. And the investment stimulus creates economic activity at the expense of increasing debt. This is what's going to happen now with the response to COVID-19, right? We're just going to have absolutely enormous public debt. Public debt is not necessarily a bad thing. It can be a problem if it leads the country towards loss of investor confidence. If people have doubts that the government is able to maintain the value of the currency, for example. So that is more of the problem. It's not so much GDP itself. Okay, so that's kind of what I was going to say about the macroeconomics. Do I still have time? Yeah. Okay, just a few more. Sorry?
I'm enjoying.
Because I forgot my watch somewhere. Okay. I was going to talk about the strategy for policy making. This is interesting. It's something that I've developed with a colleague at UK government, and we are proposing this somehow. Because the UK works with cost-benefit analysis, and for the reason that I just gave, it's a problem, and it's not like people don't realize it's a problem. What cost-benefit analysis is a set of guidelines that the government has to use to analyze policy before sending it to Parliament for adoption, right? In whichever country you are and whichever analysis is done, there is an official process for processing, say, scientific and economic whatever evidence to underpin the decisions, and it's going to be created by models, and models are themselves flawed in many ways, but they are the evidence you've got. But if the framework for analyzing information forces you in a certain direction, it's potentially limiting the way you can do policy making. So cost-benefit analysis leads to problems when you have negative costs, when you have uncertainty, when you have complex dynamics. Okay, so then I was going to talk about uncertainty a little bit. In fact, what we're doing is, in the UK, we're proposing to use something called a risk-opportunity analysis. So instead of cost-benefit analysis. And it's sort of an acknowledgement that you have uncertainty. And if you have uncertainty, I'd call it fundamental uncertainty, you could say, we're looking at the direction of change, not the end point. You could say, we are aware that adopting a certain policy could send the economy in a certain direction, but we can't say exactly where it would go, but we can say it's the right direction, something like that. You could say it increases risks of financial instability, it increases risks of the climate damages, it increases risk or decreases risks of climate damages, or it increases risks of poverty, inequality, because you can never be completely sure. Okay, so how would that work? I'm going to try to fix the problems of cost-benefit analysis for you. And maybe it's useful for people in whichever setting of policy making, let's say. So I have to learn in Brazil, actually, how the process works in government. I'd be quite curious. Okay, so imagine the state was to think it was going to behave like a company in terms of its view of investing in R&D. What do companies do? I dug out this paper recently, Klingbeil and Rammer, the Germans, I think, Strategic Management Journal. They say, they analyzed a huge data set of companies in Europe. They say there's evidence that companies become more successful when they invest in R&D. Okay, that's kind of the basics, but in fact, it's more complicated. Companies are successful when they have a good combination of investing in many different things, breadth of investment, so different types of projects to hedge risk, right? They have commitments to R&D, so what they invest in, they bring it to term, but they have a good selection mechanism where they're happy to kick out projects that don't seem to lead anywhere. So companies that do this tend to have good return on investment in general. And more generally, you say a company not investing at all in innovation will fail because it will eventually become obsolete. So that's the graph there, like low R&D investment. Too high R&D investment would lead to potential strategic mistakes and an accumulation of them, which means that you could lose too much money on too many projects because there's too much uncertainty. So you think in general there should be a middle ground where you want to be. So if you were going to do an analysis of opportunity for investing in R&D, you'd think there's a kind of healthy middle ground for R&D investment. But where is that is kind of the big question. Now, if the state is an entrepreneur and thinks we will subsidize R&D investment for low carbon innovation to drive the transition, is that good for the economy? It depends, right? And that's, I think, the big question many people need to answer. Okay, at the same time, you can look at how companies view uncertainty. Uncertainty is not just bad, it's not just risk. Uncertainty is also opportunity. Because imagine if there was no uncertainty, no companies could make any money. In fact, venture capitalists could never make any money because they make money out of uncertainty, really. They make money out of looking for projects that look promising and bringing them to fruition. And what they invest in, 9 companies out of 10 go out of business, and then the 10th one makes the big money, right? And that somehow keeps them afloat. So they're good enough that they manage to have enough wins compared to all the losses. So a company will look at the future and have a range of uncertainty bounds and will keep readjusting its decisions as time passes. So as time passes, so you've got your cone of uncertainty looking at the future, and as time passes, you've got a realization and then a new cone of uncertainty, right? And so uncertainty reduces to 0, and then you've got and because the economy is path dependent, well, you can have your expectations also become path dependent, and every moment people reassess their strategy, right? So in fact, everybody uses uncertainty in their decision making as time passes. In fact, nobody would want the future to be predetermined. And the same, I think, for policy. So policy, you'd have to for climate policy, I think you'd have to put yourself in the shoes of an entrepreneur and thinking, I'm going to invest in these various possible technologies and then see what happens, which one is best, and then I'll kick the other ones out and keep that one and keep, diversifying and kicking out projects, right? Okay, so here's the kind of proposal. Because you can't form probability distributions for what the outcome is of GDP, for example, or return on investment in certain ventures, but you have an idea with the models what the direction of things is. You can tell where things are going with a certain amount of investment in certain technologies. Okay, so you can't take like Nordhaus, you can't take expected values. You can't say the average of the outcome is this and that. What you can say is there's a kind of general direction things are taking, and there's risk that's accumulating in the system. And then you can tell whether the risk is too much and whether the direction is the right thing. And these are two different things, right? So with my friend in UK government, we were thinking, you can think of 3 types of functions in government, 3 types of people. You've got the strategists, they want to see where things are going. You've got the regulators want to know that things are stable. And you've got accountants, they want to know how the government resources are allocated, right? So you can look at the risk part, that's for the regulator to check that we're not driving the economy towards financial instability, for example, by having too much debt, or having an unstable electricity sector because you've got too much intermittency in renewables. But you can also tell the accountant can tell whether the treasury it can afford the transformations that are happening, and the strategist can tell whether it's going in the right direction. But lastly, you can also look at what opportunities there could be in the economy that are generated by your investments, and these are also very uncertain. So they're kind of the opposite of tail risk. They're like the tail opportunity. So we're writing this paper that we're going to sort of share with people in government. We'll see what they think. It's very new, right? But here's the difference in thinking. So imagine in the equilibrium picture, typically people would say, you're going to tax the externality, and it's going to give you a new equilibrium, right? And your uncertainty, you tend to think it's parametric uncertainty, and you can give an uncertainty range to where the outcome is. But in reality, I think that's underplaying uncertainty. Uncertainty is long-tailed. You probably don't know all the possible outcomes. But if you have a non-equilibrium dynamical economy, what you're going to have is things like diffusion makes costs go down, which makes diffusion go up, which makes costs go down. And so the costs are continuously changing. And then you put your policy in, and it just accelerates things. So you get a new direction of travel with lots of uncertainty. And so you can look at how things are changing direction by creating all these different scenarios of where things could go. And then because you've got too many things going on in the economy, you've got long-tailed distributions of outcomes, and you've got to live with that, right? So that's where you do your risk opportunity assessment. I think this is a more clever way of using information that's available in your policy, in your climate policy. So I mean, what I was talking about GDP in the earlier graphs, it's so complicated, you can't be sure this is correct, right? I think we could tell which direction it's taking. Okay, so that's kind of it, really. So I was going to say, too many complex things give heavy tails, so you should assume that you've got heavy tails. And you can, as part of a risk opportunity assessment, you could look at uncertainty, multiple dimensions, risks, benefits, and then lastly, I think this is cool, the concept of externality really is systemic risk. I think of the COVID situation, right? When you see some guy going to party with some kids in the street, what you think is he's really bad because he's increasing everybody's risk of catching the disease, because he's going to go back home and give that to his parents, and then and so on and so on. And that's going to increase the load on the health system. But you can't be sure he's going to catch the disease. That's the thing. So you can't be sure what the contribution is. What we can say is that he contributes to society-wide systemic risk. So your externality really is systemic risk. It's the risk that everybody has of catching the disease. And when you think of what the government's been doing by imposing lockdown, is they've been trying to minimize systemic risk. They're not minimizing costs or benefits. They're minimizing systemic risk. They're already doing risk opportunity assessment, in fact. It just doesn't have a name, right? So that's it. I was going to just conclude with this. Learning from decades of neoliberal policy, innovation starts at universities, not with entrepreneurs, and it's really where the heart of creation is. And by that can have leadership, because universities are publicly funded. So we have leadership in creating the new economy, right? And government is the largest venture capitalist, or should be. And free markets lack technological leadership. In fact, it just kind of leads nowhere. While direction can come from the government for the direction of innovation, the unknown is often good in innovation systems, and no progress is made without the ultimate role of the venture capitalist, which is the government. Yeah, that's it. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this inspiring presentation. So, if you are okay with that, I can open the floor for questions. So you can open the microphone and make the question right in the chat, and then I ask the question to Jean-François. While waiting, just some comments, because we did some studies using some general equilibrium models, but mostly static models, and we are always looking for some measures that could get a double dividend. So I think Carolina Grotter is there. It was her thesis. And the idea is to analyze some policy, for example, using the money coming from carbon tax to kind of green check or reducing the cost of labor. So, and of course, we also split in different income classes to analyze classes by classes. And we could find one measure that could come to a double dividend. So, but anyway, there is a role for the government to play in order to get this double dividend. So when you say that, of course, computable general equilibrium model has some hypotheses. It's very strong for us. For example, the perfect competitive markets. In developing countries, we are very far from something like that. So that's why we prefer to use some non-equilibrium models. And the result you showed is just show us that first the role of the government. So this the market itself doesn't solve our problem. So we need the government not only in this situation of lockdown, but also to improve the innovation as venture capital, as you said. So this is very, very interesting result. So does anyone want to make some questions? Oh, if it doesn't have any questions, you want to make some comments, some final comments?
Yeah, on what you just said, I was going to say, well, it's not like the non-equilibrium model that we use, or that the theory we've got is not. It's not like we have the final sort of ultimate theory. And in fact, the debate we have with the Greeks, I think, is the most amazing thing, because we really question everything, right? They can really question us. We can really question them, and eventually we learned a lot from that. So first, in CG models that don't have a financial sector, you get a completely different outcome than if you do have a financial sector. And what happens in your CG model is you're shuffling money around between the future and the present. So effectively, your savings go to the future. Well, you're borrowing money from future agents, and that completely changes the picture for crowding out, right? So first, that really matters. But not many people have CG model with finance, because it's quite complicated, because you need to optimize, including people's future sort of you need to optimize in a setting where future people repay their debts. So, yeah, sure. But at the same time, we don't really model too well the credit worthiness, so everybody gets finance, which is also not correct, right? So in some sense, we're at the two ends of a spectrum. We should be in the middle somewhere. And I do believe the ultimate model would be somewhere in the middle. Now, what you say about double dividends, that's going to be positive in both types of models. You always, but in reality, income from carbon pricing will always be spent somewhere, unless the government pays debt back. If the government pays debt back, it's not spending it. That's really bad for GDP, right? Yeah. Government paying back debt is not ideal for GDP, but sometimes the government has to do it. That's the picture. But if it doesn't, then it's spent on something. ideally, if it's spent on productivity increasing activities, that leads to a better long-term outcome. So that's great. If it's spent on bailing out fossil fuel companies or just paying people for doing nothing, that gives you less long-term productivity improvement. So that then becomes another sort of key assumption that you've got to make. For COVID-19 now, governments are spending money just for the sake of it, so that people don't just like go into poverty, right? And they're paying companies so that they don't completely lay off all their workers. They're just paying them to do nothing, which is of course very expensive.
Yeah, sure.
But eventually, what they need to decide to do is: are they going to bail out high carbon companies? Are they going to bail out airlines? Are they, and if not, it's terrible for these people. If they do, they're going to shut them down again later. So, if they have, for those countries who have climate targets.
Yeah. Our Minister of Economy got his PhD in the University of Chicago.
Oh, yes.
So you could have this conversation with him. The problem, he never hear anybody. Yeah, but yeah, it's nice to hear this point of view. Yeah, because it's not like that the economy works.
No, I think the previous administration had better economists.
Yeah.
Despite all the problems, the previous, let's say, the way back with the Labour government you had, they had some interesting people doing the economic advising. I've heard of some of them, but of course, and in Brazil there's a whole diversity of economists.
Yeah.
Not
in the government.
Not in the government. Well, not anymore. Let's say.
Yeah.
Well, it comes with the type of government, doesn't it?
Yeah. I think there is one question because Rodrigo unmuted his microphone.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you for your lecture. I would like to make a question for you. That a really good topic or for discussion. And I was thinking, recently we saw a move from the companies looking for ESG. That is like an altruistic way to think, or it's a market drive from governments. What do you think about this point?
ESG, do you mean corporate governance? Do you mean the rules for companies in investment?
Yeah, the rules for investment. They're like the MSCI index, like they make in financial market. So they are starting to look that to sometimes to attempt the rules of the countries, but sometimes trying to look long term for the companies. So this is from the market. This is altruistic way to think. How do you see this point?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not against. Say, I'm involved in a discussion over here, which I didn't talk about, but it's the systemic risk from the transition. So it's the fact that if people keep investing in high carbon capital, and if you have a transition, there is going to be lots of financial losses. And if that happens, there could be a financial instability. And that's a debate between central bankers. So that's kind of parallel to what you're saying, but I'll come to that. So the point is, there's rules are developing for companies to better decide how they invest, considering a wider range of elements. When people invest sort of ethically to look at reducing emissions, there's also a component investing towards lower risk. I mean, not so long ago, people could still question this, whether there could be risk in the financial sector due to fossil fuels. I think since a month or two, nobody questions that anymore. Now you've had a negative oil price recently. This is where people were paying for other people to store the oil because they had nowhere, it had nowhere to go. There was too much oil for the system to take. This is unprecedented. I mean, imagine. So now if there's risk, and much higher risk than people used to think in fossil fuels, then people now need to start to consider that risk. If fossil fuel investments are at the top of pension funds, it's a problem because these are pensions. It's too risky for pensions, right? So now you need to reshuffle everything. I think the market will deliver some of that as information comes in, of course, and I think there needs leadership as well. So I really am for all the discussions that are about corporate governance and say disclosure and so on, transparency. This is excellent. But everybody in finance tells me, whenever I've talked to people in investment, they say that does not replace climate policy. So that's not going to drive the transition. It's just going to avoid the risk that comes with the transition.
Oh, nice. Thank you for everything.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Is there any other question? So, thanks again, Jean-François, for the inspiring presentation. I think this will help all of our students to decide which methodology, which subject they can choose for their thesis. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. You know, Amaro, we've always wanted to find money to work together and never managed.
Yeah.
We should do. And but if any of you guys want anything from us, we're really we'll provide you anything you need, and it'd be nice to get to work together one day and on these questions. So if you have questions, just send me emails and I'll forward anything that you might need.
Nice, yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, nice to see you all. Thanks very much.
Yeah, au revoir.
Okay, au revoir. See you next time.
Yeah, ciao.